going forwards with lab developer workshops, where applicable, we're going to carve off a piece of the time at the beginning to sort of talk about new features, new capabilities that we've introduced in the platform, or changes which might affect lab developers, TMS users, and so on. And then we're going to do the traditional lab developer type stuff going forwards from February onwards. So we're just going to sort of shake up the format just a little bit. So obviously just wanted to highlight that to you. So in terms of today, as always, we've got our little bit of an introduction. So certainly Kat and Eric, you're well familiar with obviously what we do in the introduction, so it's no change there. And then we're just going to sort of have a little chat about the changes that have occurred in the Lab on Demand platform, which are changes which obviously you can see. Some of this we've been talking about, so you might have been contacted about, obviously, if you've got lab profiles that met certain criteria. And then we'll just have a quick look at a change that we've implemented in the TMS as well. And then obviously just the normal bit of wrap up. We'll start on with the updates for Lab on Demand. So it's a slightly bigger section in terms of some of the changes. Now, obviously, we're not going to go through, we've obviously maybe squash the odd bug, stuff like that. It's about those elements which effectively you can touch, which are actually going to potentially have an impact on the way you might work and so on. Okay, we'll have a quick look at them. So maybe the big one, which has maybe been the biggest conversation around, is the fact that we've made a change to the way the lab durations technology works. And I think one of the things that's really important before we sort of dig into that, and also with the revamped virtualization sizes, is ultimately as Skillable, we see ourselves as a cloud provider that provides a self-service infrastructure for people to develop lab-based solutions using infrastructure as a service, or potentially using some platform as a service with technologies like containers. So that's how we position ourselves. So one of the things we've been trying to do is try to align ourselves a little bit more with the way cloud providers work. So actually there's some commonality in how we're presenting our platform and how those providers present their platform as well. So hopefully that makes life a bit simpler, especially for when we start to onboard new customers. I appreciate obviously for people with extensive technical skills and obviously a lot of experience with us, sometimes you can say, well, is it worth making that change? But obviously for some of the customers that we're maybe going to be attracting, this is going to be something they're going to find hopefully quite useful. So the lab duration changes, there's been a couple of significant changes to the lab profile configuration. Now, I guess ultimately, when we talk about the lab duration changes, we really did two things here. So the first thing was actually to fix a bug in our platform. Okay, and ultimately the bug that we had in our platform, we knew the bug was always there, was the fact that effectively you could run a lab for as long as you ever wanted. Effectively there was no limits on the ability to extend a lab, even though our documentation told you there was and stuff along those lines. We actually never enforced it. Okay, so the first part was to fix the bug. The second part was to try and actually make the experience simpler. I remember for myself as being a customer, when I was a customer of Skillables, I didn't, for example, immediately start to understand, well, did the expected duration or did the maximum duration, what affected the bill? What was the value that appeared in the lab client? It just seemed a bit confusing. So obviously the whole idea was really just to simplify that, tidy that whole experience up. So the first thing is we don't have two timer boxes anymore, and we now have a single duration field. Okay, so that works exactly the same way as the old expected duration box. So the idea being, the idea was with the expected duration, if you felt an average user should take 2 hours to complete this lab activity, then you would set that to 2 hours. And then the idea is they would effectively allow you to use the maximum duration to effectively add some buffer time for those users that were not the average users, so the ones that would take a little bit longer for whatever reason, for example. So the duration field now replaces the expected duration. Now, one of the things, if you have looked at this, you would notice that it's now a drop down field which you select time options from. Okay, so effectively there's a list of time options to pick from the field. I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, one of the first questions we did get about this when we started to put this field in place, and we're actually fixing the bug which is enforcing the lab duration, and we'll get to that in more detail in a second. This actually doesn't have any impact on lab developers. Okay, so one of the key things here is for lab developers that are using Lab on Demand and they're creating new labs, they can keep extending the lab if they want to. Okay, they're not going to be impacted by the restrictions that we've put in to fix, or not restrictions, but fixing the bug. So a developer may still continuously extend a lab. Okay, it's only when you consume the lab via a production API consumer, or you consume it via our TMS, does the timers actually come into play. That's the idea behind it. The other thing which has been tidied up as part of this is the lab client. So actually the timer, the learner sees, or the user sees at the top right hand corner, is actually the time that's in the duration field. That's the piece of time that they will actually see. That will be the time that will count down. Okay, now that's changed from the way it used to be, because what used to happen, where we had the expected duration and the maximum duration, what you actually saw in the lab client was the maximum duration time. That's the time that you saw there. So from a user's experience point of view, that's the first point of change. And actually what I would say from the point of view of communication we've had back from instructors specifically, that's maybe been the area of the biggest area of concern. In the fact that, instructors have gone, oh, I've got less time for this lab now. I don't have the same sort of time as I had before. And whereas in reality, it's highly likely they do have the same amount of time. It's just because we're showing the duration field rather than the maximum duration field. Okay, so that did cause some initial instructor concern, but hopefully through communication, that's been actually improved. Now, just like before, and we'll see this again in a moment, you can enable the labs to be extended. Okay, so if you think about the maximum duration, that was a box where technically you could put the time in that the labs could be extended to. And as I've mentioned, that's really where the bug was, because we didn't enforce that time, because users could indefinitely extend. So now you don't have a maximum duration. The maximum duration is actually generated from the duration field. It will be 150%. So back to my example of you've got a lab that runs for 2 hours, the actual maximum duration, which automatically gets calculated, would be a 3-hour period. So the lab could actually run for up to 3 hours. So first and foremost, you can choose whether you want to enable that feature or not. Okay, so that used to be enabled on the advanced page. You can choose that you don't want to enable that feature, and so the labs cannot be extended. Now, maybe the primary use case for that might be exams. You can imagine if you're using us for performance testing and you give somebody a 60-minute exam, you don't actually want them to be able to extend the exam. You want to say, right, at the end of the 60 minutes, that's all the time that you've got. Now, as I say, this field used to be on the Advanced tab. To make life easier for lab developers and actually make this setting more obvious and more visible, it has now been moved onto the Basic Information tab. So it's actually right next to the duration field, if you've not seen that. So as I've mentioned a few times now, we have got this automatic system-generated maximum duration. So the key things here is it's 150% of the time that you actually put into the duration field. So certainly I know for Kat and Eric, there was some communication with yourselves because of having lab profiles or lab instances where learners had actually exceeded the 150%. And obviously before we implemented this, we didn't want you to be in a situation where you're actually going to have learners that are expecting to be able to use the labs for a longer period of time than what the lab duration was configured for. So obviously at that point, you could then make a decision whether do we need to actually increase the duration of this particular lab, or is it a case of actually the lab's got plenty of duration, so therefore it becomes a bit more of a communication exercise. You know, I could give you an example of another customer where they actually had one of our customers, they actually had some lab instances for a lab profile where the lab profile actually only had a duration of 60 minutes, but they had a large number of users that had actually been running that lab for over 3 days. Okay, and just obviously using the extend duration option. And so one of the conversations with them was actually, you know, what does that timer need to be? And actually talking to them, they went, well, the lab takes 30 minutes to do. So there's actually no reason for them to extend the duration. It was just about them having the correct communication with the support teams and so on to make sure those particular users were handled and addressed correctly. And as I said, effectively, if you do allow extensions, this maximum time is now enforced. So that's the bug that's effectively been fixed where we never used to enforce it before. So in terms of what this looks like, just from a couple of screen grabs, you can see obviously on the left hand side here. So this is the basic page. OK, so we've actually just got the duration field now, which is a drop down box. And then you've got the optional tick box where you can actually specify that you'd like to extend the lab by a certain amount of minutes when there's only a certain number of minutes remaining. So extend the lab by 15 minutes when only 10 minutes are remaining. So in this instance, for example, we'll get down to 10 minutes remaining of the hour. We will then prompt the user if they would like to extend their lab. So they say yes, so they will get another 15 minutes added. And then when they've actually only got 10 minutes of that time left, you know, they'll get prompted again, and that would then be their last extension, because that in this case would get them to their 150%. Now we will notify them of that, and I'll show you what that element of the experience looks like. The other place where there's been changes, I mentioned, is actually on the advanced page. So the first thing on the advanced page in the save and cancel options is obviously you'll notice the prompt to extend time option is removed. That's been removed because obviously we've moved it to the basic page. Okay. Tricky question is, can anybody else spot what other options been removed? There used to be an option on that page, okay, which was actually the option that said, how much time did you want to allocate to a resumed lab?
I was looking for that. I can't find it anymore. Because that goes to my auto save. So when you resume a save lab, we were finding that it was going above the maximum and it was causing havoc for us. Yeah. So I wanted to make sure that if that was a feature that we could set that, or is it now adjusted? Obviously, you're going to tell us about it. So.
Yeah, yes. So that's actually gone now, basically, because of the way the timing systems now work. Again, you know, ultimately, we really remove that option because of abuse. You know, so ultimately that's gone away. So obviously, because of the way we do the timings now, you know, you can't actually add more time than this 150% effectively. Now, I don't think it's going to be fixed this month. There is a small bug, okay, and actually the biggest problem with this bug is it could be very misleading to users. So that's why I want to highlight this so that you don't do this by mistake, because it could then cause user sort of unsatisfaction. Okay, the prompt user to extend time box on the left hand side, where I've got 15 in there at the moment, we don't validate that correctly for a time. So for example, what I could say is I could say prompt users to extend time by let's say, for example, 480 minutes, and it would save that. Okay, now it won't actually allow you to the lab to extend to that to add 480 minutes. It will still enforce the 150% time. The problem you will get, and this is where you get the user dissatisfaction problem, is when the user gets prompted, it will say, oh, do you want to extend your lab by 480 minutes? And they say yes. and it won't extend it by that amount of time because the 150% rule would kick in this particular example. So that will be fixed shortly, but just be aware that that's not correctly checked at this moment. One thing just to be aware of, and when I say coming soon, I'm not sure if it's tonight or tomorrow night. Okay, we're going to do a small update because actually having that drop down field here has become a little bit restrictive. Okay, because there's really not enough options for everybody there. So actually we are doing an update to the duration field, okay, where you will actually be able to type in the time, okay, and then you'd be able to select minutes, hours, days. So you can actually put a range in there from 15 minutes all the way up to 14 days for the lab duration within 15-minute increments. Okay, so you will notice by the time you come back on Monday, this will have changed. So the UI will be slightly different. Okay. So just to give everybody that bit more flexibility rather than a drop-down box. So just in case you've not seen it, just from the sort of learner and instructor's point of view. So obviously, as we mentioned, the timer at the top of the lab client is now the duration field, not what used to be the max duration, and it's not duration times 150%. So it's whatever is in that duration box to start with, and then of course we'll add time if they're allowed to extend. The extend box hasn't changed at all. Okay, so again, you've got the 10 minutes left, and we would like to extend your lab by 15 minutes. So pretty straightforward there. Okay, and then the last part is actually when they're going to hit the 150%. Okay, so this is where basically they will get told that, you know, when you say yes, I'm going to extend my lab, it will then when they're going to hit the 150%, they will then be told how much longer their lab's going to be extended by, and that it cannot be extended any further. Okay. So that's the sort of user experiences. So that sort of box on the right hand side is maybe the biggest box that users are going to notice a change if they get to that point of using nearly the 150% of time. So they're the UI changes. Cool. So I was going to do a little demonstration. Okay, so obviously if I just go back to the Create Lab profile, just to obviously just sort of recap, so pretty straightforward. Obviously the drop down box, as we saw, this is going to change into a box you can type in either tonight or tomorrow. So it'll be there for Monday, and this is obviously where you can sort of turn off. So this is very similar to the option we had on the advanced page before, so just be moved there. And then obviously the advanced page, we just don't have that resume time for save labs. Okay, to highlight that. Cool. Okay, excellent. Well, it's a bunch
could
of
you could you just go back to the, so what's that 5 minutes ability to resume, activity required to enable autosave? The 5 minutes that's always there by default. Does that mean I need at least 5 minutes to successfully save an environment? If I don't have it, it won't allow me to autosave. So am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, so basically that's requiring there to be sort of 5 minutes worth of activity by someone doing something in the lab. Yeah. You know, that doesn't mean obviously a solid 5 minutes. It could be that they, for example, you know, create a folder, read a whole load of instructions, and then 4.5 minutes later come back and create a file in the folder. You know, but basically you've got this every 5 minutes, providing we've got that, or that first 5 minutes, we've got some activity going on across that first 5 minutes. Then if we get to the point that we're going to hit one of the save timers, we will then auto save as opposed to cancel.
Okay. Thank you.
You know, there's sort of theory behind that, and obviously it is a timer you can adjust, is the fact that, you know, if someone's actually done, you know, less than 5 minutes worth of work, then it's more likely of no benefit in saving the lab, because when they resume it, they'll have to think, well, what did I do anyway? And actually almost start again from the beginning. The next thing that we've changed is this concept of creating what we call virtualization sizes. So before, we used to give a complete free hand for people to turn around and specify how many CPUs they wanted, how much memory they wanted, and network adapters. And ultimately, giving people free hand at one level is very flexible, but actually causes some, capacity challenges. One of the reasons actually cloud vendors effectively provide a list of sizes is so they can get the right density of systems on their platforms. So, one of the things that actually, like, so for example, Microsoft do with Azure is they define this concept of a slot, and a slot represents a certain amount of processor for a certain amount of memory for a certain amount of storage and so on. And the idea is when you build a virtual machine represents either a whole slot or multiple slots or even just part of a slot, and it allows you to utilize the infrastructure much more efficiently. And so therefore, from Microsoft's point of view, they can scale better, they can load balance better, and so on. So we're really sort of, again, going down that road and really starting to implement that same model. So hopefully that's going to allow us to give, again, customers a much better controlled, consistent experience. It's quite funny, actually. Often when we talk about things like performance, often performance can be a bit of a perception. Okay, and actually sometimes I actually, often when I teach performance tuning, I used to often say actually really exceptional performance is a problem as well. And the reason for that is when you get poor performance, the differentiation between great performance and poor performance becomes really big. So the problem you have is actually really what you want to do is you want to close that gap. So therefore, the difference between good and bad is really small. So therefore, you get consistency, and then everybody has an understanding of what a system's going to perform like. And that's really what we're trying to do here, get that consistency of experience. So we implemented these for both container and virtual machine environments. So really what we're defining is the connection of the amount of CPU against the amount of RAM via a sort of single drop-down box. Now, unlike the duration fields and so on, this is actually only going to affect new profiles going forwards, or profiles if you want to change the amount of CPU or the amount of memory that's on them and so on, that you sort of move across to this new drop-down box. Now, one of the things you will notice with respect to virtual machines especially is in there it also lists the number of network interfaces. So a couple of things to be aware of here. The first thing is if you go and pick a profile that says it has 4 NICs, we don't go and add 4 NICs to the VM. Okay, you still have to go and add the number of network interfaces you want. All this is doing is limiting the maximum number of network interfaces that virtual machine profile can support. Okay, now obviously this is really, in terms of what we've developed here, is based on our experience and based on the majority of what our customers are doing. Now, of course, there are going to be exceptions to the rule, and there are going to be customers that are going to need something slightly different. Okay, so so whereas this list exists today, it's not fixed. We are going to add some additional sizes and capacities to it, and you can submit a support request if you've got a critical business need to have a different size created. But you would need to submit a business case effectively with some sort of justification of why you can't use one of the existing sizes. Unlike a lot of things where you just place a support call and our support team will happily go and do it, we've got a bit more sanity checking going on here with this. Okay, so I just wanted to sort of highlight that. So if you've not seen the sort of new interface on the drop-down box now, where we used to have the size sort of information, we've now got these sort of predetermined sizes. So we've got obviously some for containers, some for virtual machines. Now we do have again a small display issue at the moment, where for the containers we're actually displaying a number of NICs in the list as well, whereas actually we don't have to configure NICs for containers. So you can sort of ignore the NIC part of that for a container, just the sort of the memory, the number of CPUs and so on. So they're the bits of that are important. So that's just changed to a drop-down box, again, really to try and obviously help our platform to make sure that we're building using this sort of slot type model, so we can scale more efficiently. We can get systems on our host more efficiently. We can return a more consistent performance experience, and obviously for a lot of people to help them make decisions. I've been working with a couple of customers recently, and you have the conversation, right, so what's the hardware requirements for this piece of software, or what do you need? And they go, well, I don't really know. So again, it's to try and help that type of customer as well. Okay, so that's the idea behind that. So just going to jump across back to my environment here, and if I were just to go and say, for example, create a virtual machine. Okay, it's pretty simple. The fact that you've got this drop-down box where you can obviously pick the size that you believe that you need. And again, as I mentioned, just because I've picked a 4-NIC machine, if I go to the network adapters, it hasn't gone and added any network adapters. I would still need to add those network adapters. So if I only wanted one, that's perfectly okay. I don't need to have the 4, but it would only allow me to have, in this particular instance, a maximum of 4 network adapters for virtual machines. Again, the network adapters, if I go back to, say, for example, containers, and I was to go and create a container image, okay, even though it has NICs at the end, we don't actually pay any attention to that. It's not relevant. So we're just going to jump across to the TMS if there's no more questions. So one thing I want to highlight in the TMS in terms of changes that have been released, and this is actually still something that's there's going to be some more updates to this over this weekend, so it will be slightly different again on Monday or Tuesday, I think, actually. So just to be aware, but it's just some visual improvements. Okay, so one of the things that we've actually implemented with the TMS is effectively what we've often defined as retake policies. So some of you would have seen that we have an option that sort of says allow retakes or allow retries against a lab activity when you go and create a course. Okay, so you could either allow people to sort of take this lab activity again and then you had no control over it, or you could say, well, you could use it once and that's it. Okay, so now we have the ability to attach a policy to it, okay, which you can define how many times that a particular lab can be retaken if you want to. Okay, and this could be quite important when you've got, for example, labs that might cost money every time you run them. So imagine, for example, labs that are running in Azure. So if you was to go and create some labs to run in Azure, even though we can turn around and say, oh, a learner can have 180 days access to that, every time they run that lab, you incur consumption charge from the cloud provider. So this is a way that you can put a limit in place, allow them to run it 2 or 3 times, rather than effectively run it constantly over 180 days, for example. Okay, so we have 2 ways that we can actually apply this type of setting. Okay, we can actually do a limit at the course level effectively. So the idea is we can turn around and say the labs in this course can be run a total of 10 times. So that means you could run one lab 10 times, but then you couldn't run the other labs that are in that course. Or if you've got, say, a course that's got 5 lab profiles, you could run them all twice, something along those lines. Alternatively, you can put the limit against the individual lab activity itself. So basically, you could have different limits against different lab activities. Okay. This applies only to our lab activities. So if you've got other objects that make up the activities in your course, documents, videos, those sorts of things, this option doesn't apply to these. It only applies to the lab activities that we actually that are basically being pulled from LOD. Okay, that's the only place it affects. So from the point of view of the sort of user interface, okay, there's a really simple tick box, which I'll sort of just go and show you in a moment on a slightly bigger screen, where you can go and put in that information. And then in the version that we have today, the only thing the user effectively gets told is when they can't launch the lab anymore, it will basically just tell them that their attempt limit has been reached. Okay, there is going to be an update that's going out over the next few days, and it will actually give them a countdown. You've used 1 of 3 attempts, 2 of 3 attempts, and so on. Okay, so there'll be a bit more detail and a bit more feedback coming to them. So let's say for the beginning of February. Okay. So if I was just to switch over, hopefully I've got a TMS session somewhere. So here's a course that I just built earlier on. And if I was just to go and edit this course, I'm still logged in. Okay, and just come across to the activities, you know, it's a really simple UI element. So normally we wouldn't actually have this box ticked. Okay, so this is the allow multiple attempts. So if the allow multiple attempts box, which is similar to the allow retakes box we always had, that effectively allows the learner to retake that lab as many times as they have access to this course, you know, as many times they want while they have access to this course. Okay, and then of course, if you wanted to limit attempts, you can then specify what you'd like that value to be in that box. Okay, so that's how you would do it on a per activity basis, and you could set different values in different activities if you wanted to. And then if I come down to the bottom here, you've also then got this ability to limit the maximum lab launches per delivery method, enrollment or course assignment. So this becomes an overriding control. So if you think about this scenario, if I've actually got 3 set for both of these lab activities, okay, that actually defines that I can run either of those lab activities 3 times. Once I've run that lab activity 3 times, I would not be able to run that lab activity again as a student. Okay. However, for the entire course, I can only run a maximum of 5 labs across those 2 activities. Okay, so I would not be able to run all 6. Okay, I would only be able to run 3 from one activity, 2 from the other. So this actually becomes sort of an overriding number. Okay, now in reality, from a real world point of view, we don't necessarily see customers using this option too much. Okay, it is going to be more they're going to apply the limits maybe on a per activity basis if they want them, and I think cloud's a prime example of those types of scenarios. Yep, perfect. Cool. Okay. So obviously great there. So I think that sort of gets me to the end of the platform updates. Hopefully this has been useful for you. So hopefully we do intend to attach this to the lab developer workshops from going forwards and things where we've got new features that we want to show people. And hopefully I might be able to convince the dev team to even show me be able to show you 1 or 2 things that are in the pipeline as well. But I also appreciate that's a very risky approach, just purely because it's in the pipeline doesn't mean it necessarily actually gets released. Feel free to email me, connect us with a social media. Obviously Slack's still there, so please feel free to keep using Slack, you know, either contributing and helping other customers, or, you know, contacting us for just questions on how-tos, that sort of thing, as always. So thank you very much, everybody. Hopefully it's been a useful hour of your day. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Obviously, if there's any questions, you're still welcome to ask. But otherwise, have a great rest of your day. And actually, it's almost the weekend, so have a great weekend.